America's wars in a nutshell, volunteer to make the bourgeoisie richer through genocide. Preamble. Method. Every claim traces to observable institutional facts. Every conclusion derives from structural mapping, no floating assertions, no appeals to emotion, no moral accusations substituting for structural analysis. The title is provocative. The analysis underneath it will be precise. Part 1. Defining the terms. Imperialism, not as insult, as structural definition. Lenin's analysis in imperialism. The highest stage of capitalism identified 5 observable structural features: concentration of production and capital into monopolies, merger of banking capital with industrial capital producing finance capital, export of capital as distinguished from export of commodities, formation of international monopolist combinations, territorial division of the world among the greatest capitalist powers. These are not rhetorical positions. They are observable structural features with measurable institutional content. Imperialism is the structural mechanism through which capital, having exhausted profitable domestic investment opportunities, exports itself into external territories, extracts surplus, and requires state military apparatus to protect and extend that extraction. The war is not the cause of imperialism. It is its enforcement mechanism. Volunteer military. An army recruited through economic compulsion rather than legal conscription. The observable mechanism makes civilian economic conditions sufficiently precarious that military service becomes one of the few reliable paths to material security, healthcare, educational funding, and social mobility for populations without inherited capital. Not a choice made from freedom, a choice made from structured scarcity. Bourgeoisie, the class whose income derives primarily from ownership of productive assets rather than from selling their own labor. The class with structural interest in expanding capital accumulation through whatever mechanisms are available, including state military force. Genocide, the systematic destruction of a people through mass killing, cultural elimination, or deliberate creation of conditions producing mass death, not deployed here as hyperbole, as structural description of observable outcomes in specific cases that will be mapped. Part 2. The structural logic of American war. American military intervention follows an observable structural pattern consistent enough to constitute a system, not a series of accidents. The pattern has 6 structural stages. Stage 1, the economic precondition. American capital concentration produces the need for external markets, resources, and investment opportunities. Domestic consumption cannot absorb domestic production at profit-sustaining rates. Capital requires external territory. This is not conspiracy. It is the observable structural logic of capital accumulation operating at scale. As domestic markets saturate, profit rates fall. Capital seeks external territories where labor is cheaper, resources are unprotected by strong states, and markets are capturable. Stage 2, the strategic interest identified. A specific territory contains something the capital accumulation process requires: oil, minerals, agricultural land, strategic shipping routes, market access, investment opportunities, or simply the removal of a government that has demonstrated willingness to direct national resources toward collective welfare rather than international capital access. The strategic interest is always capital's interest. It is always represented publicly as national interest. These are not the same thing. Observable example: Iran, 1953. Mohammad Mossadegh, democratically elected, moves to nationalize Iranian oil industry, directing Iranian resource wealth toward Iranian collective welfare rather than British petroleum extraction. CIA and British intelligence execute coup. Mossadegh removed. Shah installed. British and American oil companies retain access. The structural interest being protected was not American national security. It was Anglo-American capital's access to Iranian oil surplus. Stage 3. The ideological preparation. The population must be prepared to support or at minimum not actively resist the deployment of military force in service of capital interests they will not be told are capital interests. This requires manufacturing a narrative. The narrative varies by historical moment, manifests destiny, God's will that Anglo-Saxon civilization expand across the continent, useful for eliminating indigenous populations holding desired land. The white man's burden, civilizational obligation to bring order to savage peoples, useful for justifying colonial extraction as humanitarian mission. Anti-communism, The free world threatened by totalitarian expansion. Useful for justifying elimination of any government attempting to direct national resources away from international capital access. The war on terror. Civilization threatened by irrational religious violence. Useful for justifying sustained military presence in oil-rich regions whose governments had demonstrated insufficient deference to American capital interests. The specific narrative content changes. The structural function is identical across every instance. Make capital's interest legible to the population as their interest. Make the extraction target legible as the threat. Stage 4. The economic recruitment. The population that will actually fight the war is not the population whose capital interests the war serves. The observable demographic pattern of American military recruitment is perfectly consistent across every conflict. The soldiers come from the populations with the least access to capital. Rural communities with collapsed economic bases, urban populations with foreclosed economic mobility, first-generation immigrant communities trading military service for citizenship pathways, communities of color with systematically reduced access to educational and economic opportunity. The people who own the capital interests the war protects do not fight the war. Their children attend universities with deferments, connections, and opportunities unavailable to the communities doing the actual dying. This is not incidental. It is the structural design of a volunteer military in a capital system. Make civilian economic conditions sufficiently precarious. Offer military service as one of the only reliable paths to healthcare, educational funding, and material security. The recruitment mechanism operates without a draft because structural economic compulsion produces the same result as legal compulsion while maintaining the ideological fiction of free choice. You didn't volunteer for the army, you volunteered for the only option the system left accessible. Stage 5. The war itself. The observable structural pattern of American military interventions. Overwhelming force, deployed against populations with dramatically inferior military technology. Aerial bombardment of civilian infrastructure. Economic sanctions producing mass civilian death before a single soldier deploys. Proxy forces armed and directed by American intelligence doing the ground-level killing while maintaining official deniability. Destruction of the institutional capacity, hospitals, water systems, electrical grids, agricultural infrastructure that sustains civilian life. The observable human cost is concentrated entirely among the civilian populations of the intervention target and the working-class soldiers doing the fighting. The observable financial cost is converted into capital returns through specific mechanisms. Defense contractors whose stock prices increase with every contract. Oil companies whose access to previously nationalized resources is restored. Construction companies rebuilding infrastructure destroyed by the intervention. Financial institutions extending loans to reconstruction governments structurally dependent on international capital. The war destroys. Capital rebuilds at profit. The population that funded the destruction through taxes and provided the bodies through economic compulsion receives none of the reconstruction surplus. Stage 6. The aftermath. The intervention target is left with destroyed institutional infrastructure. Governments structurally dependent on international capital through debt relationships. Populations traumatized, displaced, and stripped of the resource base that sustained them. Political structures designed to be stable enough to protect capital investment while being too weak to direct national resources toward collective welfare. This is not failed nation building, it is successful capital extraction. The failure framing assumes the goal was collective welfare for the target population. The structural analysis reveals the goal was capital access. By that measure, the outcomes are consistent successes. Part 3. The cases mapped the Philippines. 1899, 1902, Spain defeated, Philippines acquired. Filipino population fighting for independence under Emilio Aguinaldo had been promised self-determination. The promise was structurally incompatible with capital's interest in Pacific market access and strategic positioning. The Philippine-American War that followed produced between 200,000 and 1,000 Filipino deaths, depending on methodology. American soldiers wrote home describing systematic massacre of civilian populations. The water cure, a torture technique, was standardized. Entire villages were designated free fire zones, the structural interest being protected. American capital access to Asian markets through Pacific strategic positioning. The population doing the dying. Filipino civilians and American working-class soldiers recruited from economically marginal communities. The population, whose interests were served, American industrial and financial capital requiring Pacific market access. Korea, 1950-1953. The Korean War produced approximately 3 million Korean deaths. American bombing destroyed virtually every significant structure in North Korea. General Curtis LeMay stated openly that American bombing killed approximately 20% of the North Korean population. The structural framing was anti-communist containment. The ideological narrative prepared for this phase of capital's expansion requirements. The structural reality, the Korean Peninsula's strategic position relative to Japanese industrial capacity, rebuilt under American direction as an anti-communist bulwark and capital investment opportunity, and Chinese markets made control of Korean political orientation a capital interest, not a humanitarian one. Vietnam, 1955-1975, 3 to 4 million Vietnamese dead. Agent Orange producing multi-generational birth defects, entire ecosystems destroyed through chemical warfare, the Phoenix program systematically assassinating civilian political infrastructure, the ideological narrative, falling dominoes of communist expansion, threatening free world security, the structural reality, French colonial capital interests in Indochina being replaced by American capital interests, Ho Chi Minh's explicit program of directing Vietnamese resources toward Vietnamese collective welfare was structurally incompatible with international capital access. A government willing to nationalize resources and direct surplus toward domestic welfare rather than foreign capital returns had to be eliminated regardless of its popular legitimacy. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the narrative justification for massive escalation was vacker to dessen SARS, one tars dessen Saigon stod, in isala de SARS. It in starter bonds, not conspiracy theory, it is declassified historical fact. The structural decision to escalate preceded the manufactured justification for it. 58,000 American working-class soldiers dead, recruited disproportionately from communities with the least capital access. The capital class that owned the defense contractors profiting from the conflict sent their children to universities. Iraq, 1991 and 2003. The 1991 Gulf War's sanctions regime that followed it produced an estimated 500,000 Iraqi child deaths from preventable disease and malnutrition by the mid-1990s. When asked about this figure on 60 Minutes, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright stated the price was worth it. Worth it for what? To whom? The 2003 invasion was justified through weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. This is not disputed. The fabrication of the justification narrative was executed by the same institutional apparatus that made the structural decision to invade. Observable structural interests served. Iraqi oil, the second largest proven reserves on Earth, had been nationalized under Ba'athist governance, directing oil revenue toward Iraqi state development rather than international capital extraction. Post-invasion Iraq signed production-sharing agreements returning oil access to international capital. Halliburton, Dick Cheney's former company, received no-bid reconstruction contracts worth billions. Defense contractor stocks across the board appreciated dramatically through the conflict period. Iraqi civilian deaths from the invasion and subsequent destabilization, estimated between 150,000 and 1 million depending on methodology and time frame. American soldiers who fought it, recruited disproportionately from economically marginal communities, returned with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and moral injury at rates the Veterans Administration was structurally underfunded to address because the capital class whose interests the war served had no structural incentive to fund the healthcare of the working class bodies whose deployment served those interests. The pattern across every case, the ideological justification changes, manifest destiny, white man's burden, anti-communism, war on terror, responsibility to protect. The structural mechanism is identical. Capital identifies resource or strategic interest. State apparatus prepares ideological justification. Working class population economically compelled into military service. Force, deployed, against target population. Capital extracts surplus from outcome. Working class soldiers and target civilians absorb the human cost. Capital class absorbs the financial return. Part 4. The volunteer mechanism, in detail. The volunteer military deserves its own structural examination because it is the mechanism that makes the entire system politically sustainable. The ideological achievement, conscription, makes the class relationship visible. When the state legally compels military service, it cannot easily hide who is dying for whose interests. The draft resistance movement during Vietnam forced partial visibility of this structural relationship. The capital class that could afford university deferments was partially exposed. The volunteer military solves this political problem through elegant structural engineering, make the civilian economy sufficiently precarious for specific populations, offer military service as the most reliable path to healthcare, educational funding, housing, and material security available to those populations. Recruit heavily in communities where the local economic base has been deliberately destroyed through capital's geographic mobility. The factory moved, the base closed, the extractive industry automated. The recruitment advertisements are structurally precise. Be all you can be. An army of one. The few, the proud. Strength, opportunity, brotherhood, education, healthcare. These are not lies about military service, they are accurate descriptions of what military service provides that the civilian economy withholds from the communities being recruited. The system creates the scarcity, then offers military service as the relief valve for that scarcity, then calls the resulting enlistment a free choice. The observable demographic confirmation, military enlistment rates correlate inversely with economic opportunity with near-perfect consistency. Communities with high unemployment, foreclosed educational access, and collapsed local economic bases produce disproportionate military enlistment. Communities with inherited capital, educational access, and economic opportunity produce disproportionate officer class, when they produce military participation at all. The people who own the capital interests the military protects and extends do not fight the wars those interests require. They fund the think tanks that produce the ideological justification. They own the media that distributes it. They sit on the defense contractor boards that profit from the contracts. They rotate through the government positions that make the decisions. Their children go to Harvard. The children of the communities, the system impoverished, go to Fallujah. Part 5. The Genocide Question. The title uses the word genocide. This requires structural defense, not rhetorical deployment. The structural definition. The United Nations Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, including killing members of the group and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. The application, the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, water systems, hospitals, agricultural capacity, electrical grids, in full knowledge that the civilian population depends on that infrastructure for survival, constitutes the deliberate infliction of conditions calculated to bring about physical destruction. This is not incidental damage, it is doctrine. The systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure has been explicit American military strategy across multiple conflicts. The Pentagon's own documents describe infrastructure destruction as a mechanism for breaking civilian will and forcing political capitulation. The observable output is mass civilian death from preventable disease, malnutrition, and medical collapse. When that outcome is foreseeable and the action producing it is deliberate, the structural distinction between killing and creating conditions for killing collapses. The Iraqi child deaths produced by sanctions were foreseeable. They were forecast by the UN before the sanctions were maintained. The decision to maintain them was made with full knowledge of the projected civilian death toll. The projected deaths occurred at the projected scale. The structural definition of deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about physical destruction was met. The population targeted. In every case, the civilian population of the intervention target is disproportionately poor, disproportionately non-white, and structurally positioned as the obstacle between international capital and the resource or strategic interest being sought. The targeting is not random. It follows the structural logic of capital's interest with consistency that removes coincidence as an explanation. Part 6. The soldier's position. The working-class soldier deserves structural analysis that neither romanticizes nor condemns them individually. Their structural position: they were produced by communities the capital system deliberately impoverished. They were recruited through economic compulsion dressed as opportunity. They were trained through institutional processes, specifically designed to suspend individual moral judgment and replace it with unit cohesion and command obedience. They were deployed into situations of extreme violence and moral complexity, without the structural analytical tools to understand what they were part of. They are simultaneously victims of the class system that recruited them through structural compulsion, instruments of the capital interests whose wars they fight. human beings carrying moral injury from actions taken inside institutional contexts that systematically prevented them from seeing those actions clearly. The moral analysis, the individual soldier who commits atrocity inside a system that trained them to commit it, deployed them into conditions producing it, and provided institutional cover for it, is not the primary moral actor. The primary moral actors are the institutional decision-makers who designed the system, made the deployment decisions, manufactured the justifications, and absorbed the financial returns while the soldier absorbed the moral cost. This is not absolution of individual action. It is accurate structural attribution of responsibility. The soldier who volunteers is not the villain of this structure. They are its most complete victim, economically compelled into service, morally damaged by what that service requires, then returned to a civilian economy that provides none of the support the recruitment advertisements implied, carrying wounds the VA is structurally underfunded to treat, while the capital class, whose interests they served, collects returns they will never see. Conclusion. The structural finding American military intervention is not a series of mistakes, miscalculations, or ideological excesses. It is the observable, consistent, structurally predictable enforcement mechanism of capital accumulation operating at imperial scale, the pattern across every case. Capital identifies external resource or strategic interest incompatible with the target population's self-determination. Ideological narrative is manufactured to make capital's interest legible as national or humanitarian interest. Working-class populations economically compelled into military service through structured scarcity. Force deployed against target population. Target civilian population absorbs mass death. Working-class soldiers absorb physical and moral damage. Capital class absorbs financial return from contracts, resource access, and market penetration. The volunteer who enlists believing they are defending freedom is structurally correct that something is being defended. It is not their freedom. It is the freedom of capital to extract surplus from external territories without interference from populations asserting the right to direct their own resources toward their own collective welfare. The genius of the system is that the people whose freedom capital most completely forecloses are the people structurally compelled to defend capital's freedom with their bodies. They volunteer because the system made everything else too expensive. They die because the system needed someone to die. The someone was always going to be them. That is not an accident of history. It is the architecture of empire operating exactly as designed.